ExxonMobil is proud to be the presenting sponsor of this program, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Deepwater Houston Ship Channel.
This program presented by Texas Foundation for the Arts.
The Houston Ship Channel is the 52-mile channel that spreads from Galveston Bay to Buffalo Bayou.
We're the largest port in the country in foreign trade.
Major cities are anchored with ports.
Well, it provides access to global markets.
The Houston Ship Channel is a vital national asset. There's no question about it.
Today, one of the largest vessels traveling the ocean is calling on the Port of Houston after a long transatlantic voyage. A Houston harbor pilot will meet the ship at the mouth of Galveston Bay and guide it up the Houston Ship Channel, one of the busiest and narrowest waterways in the world. When the ship reaches dock, it will spend the next 24 hours unloading cargo and reloading for its next voyage. The Houston Ship Channel is a major global destination and a huge economic engine for Texas. Every year, tens of thousands of vessels pass through these waters bound for one of the most landlocked ports in the country. Originally, the heart of the port, the Houston Ship Channel, was a narrow waterway that had to be widened, deepened, and straightened for ocean-going vessels to enter.
It's a 52-mile waterway that extends from the Gulf of Mexico to the Turning Basin and has provided significant economic prosperity from its inception 100 years ago.
The Port of Houston has more foreign port calls, more ships coming in from foreign ports than any other port in the nation.
They're coming from all over the world, from East Asia, from North Europe, the East Coast of South America, so our port really serves the whole world.
Where a port naturally wouldn't be. It's man-made. It's longer than the Panama Canal.
We have so much commerce that comes into the United States from overseas that it's a critical component of our highway system. It's a maritime highway.
An engineering marvel for its time, the Houston Ship Channel stretches from the Gulf of Mexico nearly to downtown Houston.
We start 15 miles out into the Gulf, where we have to go that far in order for us to have enough depth to bring the ships in. Then we pass the barrier islands at Galveston, and then we move 25 miles across Galveston Bay.
The Houston Ship Channel itself is a waterway that is authorized by the federal government and is maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
It's the home now to the largest petrochemical complex in the nation and 150 private industries that call the Houston Ship Channel home.
The Port of Houston is enormous, contributing nearly $500 billion to the nation's economy and generating more than 1 million jobs for Texas.
The Port of Houston is the most irreplaceable port in the nation.
Cargoes arrive at Houston and are then distributed by rail and truck to America's heartland.
We're different than a lot of ports in that we're in almost all maritime trade lanes. We do oils, we do chemicals, we do refined products, we do plastics, we do steel, we do windmill blades, cars, containers, coal. It's all kinds of different products.
People are surprised to learn that we have 8,000 ship transits a year, 200,000 barge transits through the Houston Ship Channel.
The Houston Ship Channel is now celebrating its 100th anniversary of maritime service to Texas. But it wasn't always a busy international port with ships waiting to enter its harbor. In fact, when Houston leaders first began dreaming of a port for their city, the Ship Channel was little more than a meandering, muddy bayou. But the group had a vision that Houston would have a deepwater port to bring cargoes into and out of Texas, and they were determined to make it happen. In 1914, the Houston Ship Channel was officially open for business and ready to receive ocean-going vessels.
Actually, 1914 is the celebration of deep water. What deep water means is when we could actually bring in ships from a foreign port straight up the channel and to the docks of the Houston port.
The premier seaport in Texas in the 19th century was Galveston. a barrier island blessed with a natural harbor. Feeding into Galveston Bay is Buffalo Bayou, a river-like stream that flows from the west side of Houston. By the 1830s, speculators and investors were pouring into Texas, and two entrepreneurs from New York, the Allen brothers, arrived looking to purchase land. They bought a piece of property along Buffalo Bayou and founded a new town. They called it Houston, named for Texas hero General Sam Houston.
So even before the Allen family got to this part of Texas, there were a number of port projects all along the coast and along the various rivers and bayous here. And then when the Allen family did get here, they chose that confluence of White Oak and Buffalo bayous to site the city. Our whole reason for being is wrapped up with the port.
Right away, the Allen brothers went about building a wharf along Buffalo Bayou and laying out a street pattern with a main street connecting to the wharf. Today, that street grid is downtown Houston, and its main street connects with that original area called Allen's Landing.
The Port of Houston was at the foot of Main Street on Buffalo Bayou, where it met White Oak Bayou. And that started the minute Houston started. In 1836, when the Allen brothers came down, they carved a gash in one of the sandbars along the bayou, and we started bringing freight into the tent city of Houston.
The descriptions of the Allen's Landing in the 1830s are colorful, kind of a muddy place with all kinds of characters coming in from the frontier.
At first, Houston was little more than a camp town. Then the Allen brothers were successful in having it established as the temporary capital of the Republic of Texas. This made the town a hub of activity for business and government.
They were able to get Houston designated as the capital of Texas. Now, that didn't last very long, but what it did do was put the city on the map. So that was one of the strokes of genius by the Allen brothers.
The Allen brothers promoted their new town back east and were quite generous in their description of Houston's landscape.
They broadcast it and had illustrations showing wonderful rolling territory with some hills and various things that weren't exactly there, but it did bring a lot of people down.
From the day of its founding in 1836, Houston leaders had dreams of ocean-going vessels delivering cargo up the bayou to its docks. Galveston thought this idea absurd, a dream that would never happen. But it did turn out that barges and small steamboats would take on cargo at Allen's Landing.
And they would load cotton and lumber from that dock onto the very shallow bayou that then would travel to Galveston, where the cotton and lumber would be offloaded onto larger ships for export.
No one really knows the name of the first boat to come up Buffalo Bayou, but it was probably Jean Lafitte's. It's probably whose it was.
One of the early steamboats to work on Buffalo Bayou was the Cayuga.
The Cayuga was a side wheeler. It was about 90 foot long. They brought everything, everybody and everything you wanted to call that would fit on that boat, they'd haul.
Buffalo Bayou was not always easy to navigate. Ship owners complained of fallen limbs and sunken boats, so the town formed an organization to collect funds to keep the bayou clear of obstructions and open to traffic. The city passed an ordinance in 1841 to build more public wharves and thus officially created the Port of Houston. Transportation in Texas was mostly by wagon or on horse or mule, often following primitive roads or muddy, obscure trails.
If you were going to go somewhere from Houston, your directions would essentially be, you want to head west along the Buffalo Bayou until it dries up, and you want to keep going until you come to the Brazos, take a right, head north for about 2 or 3 days. I mean, in some cases, maps just did not exist, and it didn't matter. The weather would be so bad, they'd be wet summers, wipe out the trail.
As a port, Buffalo Bayou would have a geographic advantage because it ran east and west and was fairly deep for navigation. Inbound cargoes could be offloaded at the town of Harrisburg and loaded onto wagons for the trip to other parts of Texas.
So by having an east-west orientation, it means that you could bypass Galveston and get to Houston and be 50 miles closer to your destination for freight.
Well, I have a painting of Buffalo Bayou that was done from best history they could come up with, and looked like it was a low-lying area with a lot of cypress trees, a lot of alligators and brush. and snags in the waterway.
Still, Galveston seemed destined to be the major port of Texas. With its closeness to deep water and its safe harbor, it considered itself the main entry into the region. However, as an island, it was hindered in transporting goods from ocean-going vessels to the interior of Texas.
Galveston had the catbird seat. It's right there at the Gulf, and everybody thought that was the right place to be. And so the Galveston Wharfage Company had very high prices.
But Houston quickly figured out a way to get around this.
They contacted ship captains and shippers, and what they did was said, just sail your ship into the bay, we'll send a barge out to meet you, we'll offload your goods, we'll do it for free, we'll bring it back up to Houston, you're already 50 miles inland.
The trip from Galveston to Houston took 10 hours if the weather and currents were favorable. By 1840, at least one steamship traveled between the two towns every day. It carried passengers, agricultural goods, and various products into and out of Texas.
These were shallow draft paddle wheelers, not much more than riverboats, and not the glamorous riverboats that you think of on the Mississippi. These were hard-working boats.
West of Houston were large cotton and sugar plantations, and the planters needed a way to get their crops to markets in the eastern U.S. Houston was the logical shipping point, and it began to grow as a center of trade.
But once the port got going, and really farming took hold in the area, cotton was king. Cotton really drove the growth of Houston commerce for a very long time.
That whole process was very complicated. It required a lot of expertise, a lot of business people who had knowledge of the whole world, how to send the cotton to other continents. That created our whole business-loving, optimistic culture.
By 1850, a railroad had been established in Houston, and soon a rail line was opened between Houston and Galveston. Before long, rail lines were fanning out in all directions from Houston, which had become the rail hub of Texas. When the Civil War began in 1861, Houston was no longer a camp town, but a growing business center.
Houstonians are an amazing group of people. They never let an obstacle stop them. Right when we got up ahead of steam, railroads were beginning to take shape and be built in the area. The Civil War broke out. Now, Houston, a lot of people don't realize, figured significantly because it was an ammunition depot for the Confederate Army.
After 4 years of bloody battles, the Civil War finally ended in 1865. Galveston leaders thought it would continue as the main port of Texas and paid little heed to upstart Houston with its narrow bayou. With the big demand for Texas cotton, Houston had become a major center of commerce. By 1873, its port was handling 75% of the goods transported to and from the interior of Texas. But it was obvious to city leaders that Buffalo Bayou would have to be widened and deepened. Houston wanted a deep water shipping channel that would stretch from the mouth of Galveston Bay up to the wharves in downtown.
The vision was always there, and what deep water meant evolved a little bit as things went along. So very early on, if you could bring a ship from New Orleans straight up into Galveston Bay and up Buffalo Bayou to Houston, that was a victory. And those things were beginning to happen.
But Houston, with its always aggressive leadership, immediately made plans to improve its facilities and the bayou. In 1870, Congress designated Houston a port of entry.
And that's highly important because then they stationed a customs agent there permanently.
Making Houston a deep water port meant vessels could carry goods to foreign markets, not just Galveston.
And then after that, what began to happen is a series of surveys were conducted on Galveston and Buffalo Bayou with the idea of what would it take to actually dredge that out.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began to survey the bayou and its possibilities. They determined it was not feasible to go all the way to downtown Houston and recommended that the widened channel terminate several miles east of there.
But as you get up into Buffalo Bayou, obviously, it's a serpentine route. It's not straight in any way. So yes, they had to very much straighten it out because as ships got bigger, making those turns are difficult.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Galveston was the leading business and financial center of Texas, calling itself the Wall Street of the Southwest. Even though Houston had a smaller population, it had become the railroad center of Texas. City leaders promoted it as the city where 17 railroads meet the sea. Goods that arrived at the port of Galveston had to pass through Houston, but Houston was not a deep-water port.
Well, there's a big competition in those days. I mean, Galveston was the established port, and they knew it, and they were proud of it, and they were accused of overcharging because they had a monopoly. So that was the impetus behind building the Houston Ship Channel.
Then, the 1900 storm devastated Galveston, killing more than 6,000 residents. Congress began to take seriously the idea of making Houston a deep-water port.
The 1900 storm was an awful chapter for Galveston. I don't think anybody can argue that. But I think Galveston was going to lose the battle no matter what. Houston was already building the rail infrastructure. Galveston could not pedal fast enough to make it worthwhile. And really, they didn't have the ability to do that. You already had a rail center in Houston. Galveston had one line leaving the island, and it still went to Houston.
The discovery of oil in the region would certainly add to the need for a bigger port.
When Spindletop opened up and the oil economy grew, it was sited here. We're not actually the closest city to Spindletop, but because we already had that business enterprise, all that knowledge, all that social capital here, it came to Houston.
Tom Ball was the congressman from Houston and was often called the father of the port. He served on the important Harbors and Rivers Committee. Ball worked hard to make sure that the interests of Houston were represented in Washington.
The conventional wisdom of the day was, okay, wait, you're going to put a port 50 miles inland? What are you thinking?
Houston argued that they had the rail connections, and it made economic sense for their channel to be a deep-water port.
Because Houston could say, bring your goods here, and it's just a little hop onto a train, and then your goods go anywhere in North America.
Houstonians believed the U.S. government wasn't moving fast enough to allocate the funds, so Houston decided to finance part of the dredging itself.
Those people came up with what was called the Houston Plan. Congress had never seen before, but it was a way of sharing the cost 50-50. Houston was to come up with $1,250,000, and the federal government was to do the same.
On November 10, 1914, Houstonians gathered at the turning basin for the official opening of the Houston Ship Channel and the Port of Houston. The city held a huge celebration with parades, balls, and pageants. It took 78 years, but Houston had its deep-water port, in spite of financial obstacles and political battles. President Woodrow Wilson pushed a button in Washington, D.C., which set off a cannon in Houston that officially opened the port to deep-water vessels. The daughter of the mayor of Houston dropped white roses into the water and declared,
I christen thee Port Houston. Hither shall come the ships of all nations and find a hearty welcome.
1914 also marked the opening of the Panama Canal, connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. But a dark cloud was hanging over Houston and its port. In Europe, the Great War had broken out, and European shipping lines were not calling on American ports, even though the U.S. remained neutral. Especially hard hit was the cotton trade, the port's biggest export. In 1917, the U.S. entered the war in Europe.
With World War I raging, there were really no ships coming up the channel at all. There were just too many embargoes on products.
When the Germans surrendered in 1918, the war was over. U.S. soldiers soon were returning home. America then saw a big demand for oil-related products, and Houston was in the ideal location. Houston's port and the oil industry were perfectly made for each other, and 6 major oil companies located facilities along the ship channel. The channel offered them deep water access and abundant land to build on. The Humble Oil Company refinery, built in 1919 in nearby Baytown, would become the largest refinery in the U.S. and one of the largest in the world. Years later, Humble Oil would be transformed into ExxonMobil.
Cotton was not supplanted as the #1 piece of cargo until 1929. And then the oil business and the petrochemical business just flourished.
The 1920s would be a decade of exciting growth for Houston and its port. A large grain elevator was built to handle grain shipments from America's Middle West to foreign markets. By 1930, Houston had surpassed Galveston in tonnage, and it never looked back. Foreign vessels were arriving every day at the port. More than 2 million bales of cotton were loaded and shipped out. The Port of Houston was now a big-time port doing big business. During the celebration of the Texas Centennial in 1936, President Franklin D. Roosevelt toured the San Jacinto Battleground and the Houston Ship Channel. He endorsed the importance of the ship channel to the nation. The Port of Houston had become the largest in the South and the third largest in the U.S. By the late 1930s, shippers were exporting scrap metal to the Pacific, mostly to Japan. Just as jobs were returning to Houston and business at the port picked up, war broke out in Europe again.
Houston was really gearing up for exports, and then all of a sudden, Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, a lot of the scrap metals that Houston was profiting from that were going over to Japan couldn't go anymore. And there were so many U-boats in the Gulf in mid-1942 that nobody really wanted to sail.
After Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, Houston's petrochemical hub took on more significance. Not only did the refineries produce fuel for the war effort, but they were producing synthetic rubber. World War II also saw the rise of 2 shipbuilding facilities along the ship channel. So Houston and Houstonians contributed greatly to the war effort.
World War II provided a big boost to the Houston area with shipbuilding here and various industries like the synthetic rubber industry growing up very rapidly in this area.
The need for rubber was so tremendous, and Houston was the sole producer of rubber. That helped stimulate the petrochemical business.
After the war, there was a great demand for American supplies and products in Europe, and the Port of Houston would handle much of the shipping. Business at the port began to pick up again. America began its love affair with the automobile. The need for gasoline and motor oil soared. Houston and its port were at the center of it all.
The fact that we had the port and the industry that it brought and the jobs that it brought allowed us to create the infrastructure to create a major city.
After the war, America became the breadbasket to the world. Grain shipments out of Houston increased, and the Port of Houston became the second largest port in the U.S. by tonnage handled. The massive petrochemical complex along the Houston Ship Channel would continue to expand after World War II, with big demand in world markets for its products.
The petrochemical industry is really what has driven this port over many, many years.
Just 4 months after the war ended in 1945, ships were lining up to enter the ship channel, and business at the Port of Houston was booming again. By 1950, an average of 10 ships a day entered the port, and as many as 4,000 ships a year called on Houston. Today, Allen's Landing is a park at the foot of Houston's Main Street. What started as a village of tents and cabins is now a city crowded with tall modern skyscrapers. East of downtown, the bayou becomes the Houston Ship Channel.
I think we're viewed as one of the finest ports in the world. Texas is the primary exporting state in the nation because of the activity at the Port of Houston, and we have been for 12 years in a row.
The Port of Houston is made up of 3 main centers of operation: the original ship channel and turning basin area, the Barber's Cut container ship facility near the San Jacinto River, and the Bayport facility, the newest terminal which handles container ships and is situated on the bay near Kemah. Each facility is reached by ship from the Gulf of Mexico through the entrance to Galveston Bay. The Houston Ship Channel is a complex transportation hub, connecting railroads, trucks, barges, deep water vessels, and a vast network of pipelines.
Our port handles about 200,000 barges in a year, moving commerce on the waterway versus doing it through trucks or other modes of transportation.
One important engineering feature of the Houston Ship Channel is the turning basin. When the ship channel first opened for deep-water vessels, it was so narrow ships could not turn around to head out to sea after taking on their cargoes. So a wide turning basin was created at the head of the channel. Here vessels could turn around on a dime and begin their journey to the Gulf. The turning basin area was the main operating center of the Port of Houston for nearly 70 years.
And although the waterway goes all the way downtown, the current ocean-going ships stop about 8 miles from downtown.
Today, the docks at the turning basin area are still in heavy use. This huge Bari ship will tie up at Dock 31 to unload its cargo. The vessel is so big that it will barely clear the busy Interstate 610 bridge spanning the ship channel. Because of the low clearance of the bridge, air draft restrictions on all ocean-going vessels must be constantly monitored.
The air draft is from the waterline of the ship to the uppermost part of the ship, whatever that is. It's usually an electronic aerial or the mast or something like that. And so you have to be able to clear the 135 feet both inbound and outbound. A lot of times we'll get an inbound ship that's loaded with steel, and coming in it's no problem. But when they discharge the steel, the ship comes up in the water and then they can't get out underneath the bridge. So you have to know all of that beforehand to try and figure out alternatives.
General cargo, also known as break bulk cargo, is mostly handled at the turning basin these days.
Break bulk is kind of cargo which doesn't go in container. Break bulk varies in different sizes. You know, it can have any size. It can be a square, it can be a rectangle, it can be octagonal. Challenging part of the job is to make everything fit, to get the ships in and get the ships out, and to serve the customer and keep the commerce flowing.
Moving large ships in and out of the ship channel is a complex, demanding operation. Meeting the ship upon arrival will be U.S. Customs, port officials and security, shipping agents, as well as the stevedores. The stevedores service the ships when they are in port.
Well, on a day like today, our company's got 5 ships working, so we have to schedule the right labor, the right equipment, forklifts, cranes, whatever's necessary to get the job done on each ship.
We're big into projects, wind energy projects, all kind of petrochemical projects.
Today we're loading some 55-meter windmill blades. We first started handling these back in 2002, and it was an import. They were coming from Denmark, which invented windmills. And now it's historically changing. We now have American export. We're shipping them from their plant in Denver to worldwide destinations. These are 55-meter blades. They're about 12 tons each. We've loaded as many as 80 or 90 on the ship, where we use the below deck space plus the on deck.
Thousands of automobiles arrive at the Port of Houston and have to be offloaded and distributed across the U.S.
We transport all Volkswagen and all Audi. We start off by opening doors. We have scanners as well that we scan each individual van, checking for any kind of destination damage or travel damage. We also make sure that the cars are going in the right order.
In the early 1950s, activity at the port grew stagnant, and Houston began to slip in the ratings of U.S. ports. In addition, the method of doing business on the docks was changing fast. Forklifts were replacing hand carts, and cargoes were loaded onto pallets instead of workers rolling barrels on board ship or using cargo nets. Ships sometimes took a week to unload, and this was expensive for shippers. A new technology was about to revolutionize shipping around the world: container ships. Houston would soon be at the forefront of this new technology, and before long, shipping companies were offering regular container service between Houston and New York, Miami, and Tampa.
The very first container move in the United States was moved from New Jersey to Houston, Texas in 1956.
Previously, ships were loaded with cargo in a piecemeal fashion, using pallets or hand carts, requiring a lot of manpower and many days to unload and load a ship.
And we knew that eventually we were either going to have to provide containerization facilities or we were going to lose the business.
Houston port officials quickly saw the future of containerization and made plans to accommodate these ships.
In 1972, we started the master plan for Barber's Cut Container Terminal.
To facilitate container shipping, Houston opened the Barber's Cut facility in 1977. It was specially designed for container ships. The new terminal was not located in the original turning basin area, but 25 miles downstream, closer to the Gulf.
Container ships wanted to be in and out of port very quickly.
Containerized shipping meant less labor and less time a ship was in port, and that improved the profits for shipping lines. Gone were the muscled, hard-working longshoremen loading and unloading ships. Now, automated loading systems and crane operators were doing much of the work.
Containers, first off, are a very efficient way of moving cargo. It's an environmentally sensitive way of the supply chain versus other types of transportation, which have more environmental impact.
Containerized shipping is huge in the global marketplace for international trade. Vessels are getting larger and larger, much faster than people had thought originally.
2/3 of all container traffic in the Gulf ports now goes through the Port of Houston.
A question people always ask is, what is shipped in containers? And the answer is basically anything and everything that fits in a container, from raw materials such as paper products, resins, steel, to automobiles and retail commodities that you can get at your local big box retail store.
The Port of Houston and containerized shipping were a perfect fit, and the port underwent a massive expansion program.
Containers are shipped all over the world. The major trade lanes that we serve are North Europe, Mediterranean, East Asian markets, as well as the Caribbean and South America.
When the Barber's Cut container facility reached capacity, the Port Authority opened Bayport in 2007 to handle even more container ships. Bayport's channel also opens directly into Galveston Bay with quick access to the open seas. The terminal is about 50% completed.
We're doing it in phases, but even at 50%, it is one of the 2 largest container terminals in the U.S. Gulf.
Every day is a busy day at the terminal. Even if we do not have vessels, we have a lot of truck traffic. We have a lot of movement throughout the facility.
Breakbulk carriers would come into the Gulf and they would stop in Tampa, and then they would go to Houston and then to Corpus Christi. And they spent most of their time in port. And if you're a ship owner, you're only making money when it's underway. And that's where the containerization changed the concept.
Each ship on average stays at the container terminal about 21 hours. So it's a very quick turnaround.
We have significant container volume, and watching that seamless work of the labor on the dock and the logistics professional on the yard, it to me is stunning.
You have to be a major player in containerization in today's world to be considered a major port.
Included at Bayport is a new modern terminal for cruise ships, which call on the Port of Houston. These ships take thousands of passengers on vacations to the Caribbean and other exotic destinations. Houston, with its central location near to the U.S. heartland, had a distinct geographic advantage. To help move truck traffic and improve automobile access to the new port areas, the soaring Fred Hartman Bridge was built over the entrance to the Houston Ship Channel, where it meets the San Jacinto River.
The Hartman Bridge is this beautiful suspension cable bridge, and it projects this sense of strength and grace. It spans a huge distance. It is monumental.
Even the biggest ships can pass safely under the bridge.
And we've got about 170 feet clearance of that bridge, and you've got ships that are, at that point, 900 feet long, perhaps 160 feet in beam, that are passing under a bridge, and it's a wonderful sight to see.
And it's hidden away in a little corner of Texas. I think Texas Monthly listed it as one of the top 10 most beautiful places in Texas that are underappreciated.
People don't have a chance to look at the bridge. There aren't a lot of public spaces and vantage points to enjoy it.
Another landmark along the ship channel is the San Jacinto Monument. To help honor the Texas Centennial in 1936, the huge monument was constructed on the hallowed grounds where Texas won its independence from Mexico. Visible for miles around, it is one of the first landmarks inbound ships see along the Houston Ship Channel. Thousands of people work along the Houston Ship Channel every day, unloading ships from foreign ports and loading American products bound for global destinations.
It is a very diverse group that makes our port work.
Before moving into the ship channel, vessels often have to wait in the Gulf of Mexico for clearance to enter. The captain of the port, who also commands the U.S. Coast Guard in the Houston-Galveston area, has the final say on daily operations at the port. Once a ship has been given approval to enter the ship channel, a Houston-based harbor pilot guides it from open water to the dock.
I board the ship in the Gulf of Mexico and then go up and talk to the captain for a few minutes, and then I take over the navigation of the ship. I usually find a seat right in front of the window, a good window where I have good visibility, and there's a quartermaster behind me, and I give rudder orders and engine orders until we get to the dock.
With dozens of ships arriving and departing every day, the Houston Pilots Association is vitally important to port operations. Each ship must have a local harbor pilot who guides the vessel when entering the Houston Ship Channel and gets it safely to its dock. The process is reversed when the ship sails from the port.
I love going to sea, I love being on ships, but piloting is just special. The ship handling is so unique. To gracefully move a 1,000-foot long ship up the ship channel and put it alongside a dock, and it takes talent, experience, and practice.
Well, we handle all kinds of ships come into Houston. Tankers, container ships, grain ships, bulk ships, general cargo ships, refrigerator ships.
These harbor pilots must perform at the highest standards every time to keep the port safe and prosperous. Each ship can be a $100 million investment with a $100 million cargo. Local harbor pilots are better aware of the channel's changing currents, weather, and ingoing and outgoing traffic.
You know, we work in a very hostile environment. We work in high winds, heavy seas, swells. Somewhere around the world, there's a pilot killed every year getting on or off the pilot ladder.
Houston harbor pilots board the inbound ship in all kinds of conditions.
When the ship gets close, our pilot boat will tell the ship what side to put the pilot ladder on, which is the safest side for us to board depending on the state of the wind and the seas. He'll then take the boat alongside the vessel, and then I will climb up this pilot ladder. And again, that is when, you know, my life is in the hands of those crew members that secured that pilot ladder to the railing up top. You know, so I will do this 30-foot climb, in some cases up a pilot ladder, and get up on the main deck. They'll bring up my navigation gear separately, and then from there we'll climb up 5 to 12 flights of stairs to get to the wheelhouse. Houston is truly one of the busiest ports in the world, and there's a pilot getting on or off a ship every 20 to 25 minutes.
Ships are getting bigger all the time, and the ships we bring into Houston are getting bigger.
And for all of us, it's about getting the ships up to the dock safely.
Through all its growth and expansion and new technologies, it has been the workforce that has made the port operate smoothly. When these huge vessels reach the docks, well-trained crews of longshoremen go to work unloading the million-dollar cargoes.
We have a great working relationship between the Port of Houston Authority and the International Longshoremen Association. Without that great partnership, what we do today would not be successful.
On any given day, there could be 1,500, 2,000 ILA members working out of a membership of about 4,000.
The International Longshoremen's Association represents the men and women working on the docks, unloading and loading the ships.
Started working here as a kid going to school, 1959, and I've been here ever since. My fathers and uncles worked at the port prior, and I've got a son that works here also. So back when I started, we were more into the food products, shipping flour and rice and to U.S. aid to other countries. We would load and unload the cargo when it came in off the trucks and the rail to be put in a location, so when the ship came in, you would load it on the ships. And back then, it was all hard manual labor.
In the early days, jobs on the docks were available only to men. the work was considered too hard and too dangerous for women. But by the 1980s, some women were finding jobs as dock workers.
I came down to the docks in 1981, and with 750 people in line, I was one of the 80 blessed people to be hired. When I first came there were very few women, like a handful. So it was an interesting transition, making that transition, the men seeing women down there in a different capacity. But I was raised with 7 boys, so that transition was a little easier for me than it was for some. My first job offer came at night, and I went there and we were discharging pipe from a vessel. And I had never been down there before. We had 5 trucks sitting under a crane, and we were taking pipe from the ship and loading it directly onto different truck lines. So it was chaos.
For many years, working groups on the docks were racially segregated.
You had the blacks worked on one end of the ship, the whites worked on another. So when I first came, they were just going through that transition of trying to bring those 2 unions together and bring the groups together. I get a lot of satisfaction from going on a vessel, working it, and then when we're finished with the ship sails off, and it's just been a good run.
I'm a supervisor, or a walking foreman is the actual job title, and I control the operation with the stevedore for the loading and unloading of the container vessels. It's changed dramatically since I started. I mean, especially, I've been there over 30 years, and so when I first started, everything was in it was either pipe product, or we were unloading automobiles, or they were still doing some bulk cotton, but which I couldn't get that job because that was a higher paying job.
It was all just break bulk cargo, as we referred to it. And then the containers came along about 68 and 69, and it changed the whole industry.
When I first started down there, and we would be throwing bags of rice or flour, and you could look and you would be in the hold of the ship and you would think, this is the same job my father did or my grandfather did 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
The men and women who work and travel on board the ships at sea are called seafarers. They are represented by the Seafarers International Union.
Our work has changed a lot over the years. That we used to have a lot of break bulk ships with large crews and low-tech vessels, and that has changed to very automated ships with smaller crews, bigger vessels, and we've had to adapt to that. Well, in the old days, the ships had probably 40 men on there, and they had real simple gear. They were winches and pallets is how they transferred the cargo. The longshoremen would unload the bags onto, and it was very labor intensive. Now it's all automated with containerization, and it requires sailors to have more high-tech skills.
In an effort to make Houston a more attractive destination to shippers and seafarers, the Houston International Seafarers Center was established near the Turning Basin. At the Seafarers Center, sailors from all over the world meet to eat, enjoy recreational activities, or participate in religious services.
They needed a place that they could feel was safe and was a home away from home.
The Port of Houston has faced many obstacles: nature, geography, politics, war, economic ups and downs, environmental concerns, and stiff competition. Since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, security measures have increased greatly.
In a port, the captain of the port is probably the most important position there is. Again, because of the 3 big missions: safety, security, and stewardship, and the broad-reaching federal regulations that govern port operations. All those come into play when you try to move a ship into a port, which is also an international border. A lot of people don't understand that all the cargo and all the people that come into the port are coming in from a foreign country.
Even with terrorism threats and security issues, cargo must continue to move through the port.
We need commerce to move across those docks. And in order to do that, I have to balance the security requirements of the law with the operations that we need to conduct.
The U.S. Coast Guard provides careful vigilance over anything that could disrupt port activities. They handle hurricane preparations for the ship channel when a storm enters the Gulf.
Once it enters the Gulf of Mexico, our clock starts and we say, hey, we're going to set these conditions for the port. No one's allowed in after this date. Everyone's got to leave the day after and things like that. So we really want all the big ships out of the port. Now that doesn't happen to perfection, but you try and move all those ships out. They're better running from the storm than sitting at the dock and taking a beating.
The Port of Houston now leads the nation in foreign cargo tonnage and is the highest volume channel in the U.S. But when work on the newly enlarged Panama Canal is completed, new larger ships will be calling on Gulf ports, and Houston must be ready to service them. Can Houston prepare for this with a wider and deeper channel?
The expansion of the Panama Canal is really an unknown for everyone involved. But what we've tried to do is put ourselves in a strategic position that we can handle any growth.
When they finish the Panama Canal, obviously larger ships will start coming to Houston, and the folks here at the Port Authority are already working on the 2 container terminals to get them ready for the bigger ships.
So many of our largest customers have advised us that they expect their exports to grow to double, triple in the next 3 to 5 years.
As for the port's expansion, the Port of Houston Authority is already dredging the ship channel to a depth of 50 feet.
Back in the early 1800s, when the channel was first developed, it was just a few feet deep. Today, the channel is 45 feet deep, and it will continue to always be addressed to meet the needs of industry.
With all the competition, we got to make sure that we get the business before someone else gets it, because once they get it, it's hard to get it back.
The silt and other materials that are dredged up are recycled to refurbish portions of the bay.
We use it to build beneficial marshes, we build it to build islands, and we, in some places, we build upland disposal sites where we just collect the material.
New environmental issues face the port, as well as the constant threat from hurricanes. One group of scientists has proposed a dike to close off the ship channel near Galveston Island in the event of a major hurricane and the resulting storm surge. The port is working to improve the environment along the channel.
We have put a lot of effort into air quality, improving air quality, water quality, our waste streams. We have to make sure that we have cleaner burning trucks, cleaner burning engines on cranes, and we are at the forefront and have been for many, many years.
The University of Houston's College of Architecture is collaborating with other major cities around the world to develop ways of protecting coastal areas from a natural disaster and to enhance the quality of urban waterways.
We have the 4th largest estuary in the United States here at Houston, adjacent to the largest petrochemical industry in the United States. But that's what we're trying to do, is preserve the quality of life that is innately part of our natural resources, and at the same time recognize the dependency on the economic reality of that industry.
The City of Houston and several civic organizations are working to restore the historic Allen's Landing area downtown as a scenic and recreational district. During the early 20th century, this historic area had become a derelict part of town. In fact, it had become the backside of downtown Houston. By the 1960s, it was a center of activity for Houston's counterculture.
It was a hot spot for hippies, for bands, for war resistors. It was the site of the Love Street Light Circus, and that was an amazing flowering of counterculture. And then that too abandoned Allen's Landing. The Buffalo Bayou Partnership has a very ambitious master plan that includes the full length of the bayou, really, from the western portion, where it's very wild and almost pristine, through the downtown area, where it's becoming this beautiful urban park, and also into the eastern section, feeding into the port.
Some visionaries see great beauty and opportunity in Houston's bayou system and the area surrounding the port.
It's usually a place where people want to go. It's a tourist attraction. We'd like to see more of that. I think there's a real opportunity for ecotourism.
Ports are the places where people from all over the world come together, and some of them might be sailors, some of them might be business people, but they mix their ideas. Ports are these really important places of exchange of goods, but also exchange of ideas and culture.
The port has given Houston an international cosmopolitan flavor that's unlike any other city in Texas. This influence can be seen in the restaurants, stores, residential neighborhoods, and even museums and cultural attractions. Because of the massive global commerce connected to the port, more than 90 foreign consulates are based in Houston, second only to New York City. Even though it's one of the greatest seaports in the world, some observers say the Port of Houston gets little recognition in its home state.
The port is kind of out of sight and out of mind. People that may live on the west side of town don't really see the port that often, but when in actuality everything that we wear, all of our jobs in some way, shape, or form are related to the port.
And the image of our port years ago was not that good, not only for Houstonians, but for seafarers. And that has completely changed. The port is not exactly your granddad's port anymore.
There's so many other major industries here, oil and gas, the medical center, that we kind of just get down the ladder of significance, but as we all know, it is the main driver of our economy.
I think the paradox of Houston and its port is that the bigger the port gets, the more it becomes invisible.
In an effort to keep the public better informed and connected to the port officials offer free boat rides on the MV Sam Houston. Every year, thousands of visitors from all over the world tour the ship channel, getting a rare first-hand look at Houston's waterfront.
We're starting our trip into the Houston Ship Channel, 52 miles from the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico. We will point out some of the major facilities as we near them.
Another group that is working to educate the public about the port and Houston's maritime connection is the Houston Maritime Museum. The museum will soon be moving to a new facility located along the ship channel.
We have a history of the port exhibit that we will expand obviously when we move to larger quarters. Our current exhibit starts at the beginning, and we have model ship scale models of the Laura, which was the first steamship to come into what was then still Buffalo Bayou. So many people, when they come to the museum, really don't have an idea of the size of the port.
In the 100 years since the grand opening of the ship channel, the Port of Houston has set the standard for modern ports. The importance of the Houston Ship Channel to the nation is huge. The petrochemical complex produces nearly half of the nation's fuel supplies.
Houston has now eclipsed New York to become the premier metropolitan exporting region in the nation.
We have so many things that we're grateful for and proud of in the city of Houston. For example, the Texas Medical Center, our arts, but there's none more singular than the Port of Houston and what it means to our economy.
Just about everything that's in your home, your appliances, your automobiles, that comes through the port. We're part of the community.
We're a man-made port. It was built off of vision and gumption.
This was about building a wonder of the world.
The Houston Ship Channel is a vital and indispensable national asset.
The channel continues to grow and expand.
Every year, this port contributes to the national economy about 2 million jobs. It contributes about $50 billion in taxes.
In 1914, when the ship channel opened, Houston had a population of around 80,000 residents. By 2014, the population of the Houston area had soared to more than 6 million. The success of the Houston Ship Channel speaks for the determination of the human spirit and the results of a group of men and women who dared to dream and refused to ever give up.
I think in centuries to come, historians will look back at the Houston Ship Channel with awe.
We are a port for Texas.
But we're really in a global economy, and that operates through ports.
This is a town that would not say no and established a deep water port 52 miles inland from the nearest ocean. And that's a heck of a story. It's inspiring.